The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBank, the bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise and banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi, making Kiwi better off. How do we make decisions about investing in something that's going to be around in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time? Do we think, gee, this will be useful for me and my family and my grandkids? Of course we should do it. We should do it all. But of course, that's the thing. We can't do it all. Resources are limited. We haven't got money for Africa, or more importantly, we don't have the resources for Africa. We have to think about what is the best project and what is the value of that project to us today versus the future, because it's just natural. If we're given $100 in our hands, that's worth more to us in our heads than if we're told, I'll give you $100 in 2 years' time or $100 now. What do you choose? Of course we choose the $100 now because, something now is more valuable to us than something in the future. And that's not just benefits, but costs. So it means that me spending something right now, $100 on investing in something versus spending it on consumption, is a much bigger deal for me than the thought of doing it in 10 years' time. And that's a problem because why would we invest in anything, particularly as a society? This week on When the Facts Change, we go deep into the detail of discount rates. What are the engines, the machines that help us decide whether we invest in something? And why is it that sometimes it feels like we don't invest enough, particularly in the long-term things? Well, it turns out part of the reason is that over the last 30 years or so, Treasury, the engine room of these big economic and financial decisions in government, has had a discount rate of first 10%. They've lowered it in recent years, but it's been quite high. And you may think, well, what's the difference between 10 and 8%? Well, actually, as you apply a higher and higher discount rate, the benefits and the costs in the future become very small, very fast. And what it's meant is that as decision makers, governments, and it's trickled down, or maybe it's trickled up from voters as well, have tended to focus on the here and now. I want tax cuts now. I don't want to invest my money and not see a benefit for 20 or 30 years. This is the me society. I'm not part of society. In fact, there is no society, as Margaret Thatcher would say. But maybe there is. And maybe as we start to think about ourselves as a community and ourselves as part of an intergenerational story, maybe we start to value things in the future in a much higher way. This week on When the Facts Change, I've spoken to Arthur Grimes, the granddaddy, if you like, of New Zealand's economics profession, academia, operation, a former Reserve Bank chairman, one of the founders, if you like, of the inflation targeting regime that we have. and now a very active researcher and teacher in Wellington with Motu Research and with Victoria University. He's had a look at this issue of the social discount rate for different types of projects. And he's been involved in a change in Treasury approach, which has been welcomed by those who think more intergenerationally, more community-wide, rather than about the individuals. It's one of these stories where the values of us as individuals and as a society get baked into a number, which no one really knows about, but which has huge implications for us. And that's meant over the last 30 or 40 years, we haven't taken those long-term investment decisions. And it's coming home to roost. And increasingly, we need to make even longer investment decisions as climates change. This week on When the Facts Change, we talk with Arthur about these big ideas, about big investments over the very long term, and how changing this number might change the decisions we make. Well, kia ora, and welcome to Arthur Grimes, you could argue one of the grand old men, that's a bit rude, but one of the godfathers of New Zealand economics. It's lovely to see you, Arthur, a senior fellow at Motu Research and professor at the School of Government and Victoria University. Great to see you.
Yeah, hi Bernard, great to be here, thanks.
That's right. The reason I say, one of the long-time researchers, thinkers about economics in New Zealand is that we're talking today about the very long term and how governments, investors, the people, if you like, think about investing in public infrastructure for the very long term, because you have to have some way of analysing it. How have we done it in New Zealand for the last, 20 or 30 years when someone jumps up in front of a minister and says, here's this motorway, should we build it? How have we done it in the past?
Well, in theory, we've done it by looking at the costs of building the motorway, the costs of maintaining it, and then put various values on the benefits that we receive once it's operational. And we add up all those benefits and we divide the benefits by the costs, and we get a benefit-cost ratio. That's cost-benefit analysis. The real issue is that how do we value benefits that happen well into the future relative to benefits today? We know that many people will prefer to have if you ask them, do they want a glass of wine today or a glass of wine next week, they'll say, I'll have it today, thanks, because I prefer it now than next week, because people will value the present more than they value the future, often for their own consumption, their own purposes. The question is whether governments should have the same approach when they value benefits that might accrue in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, or in particular, maybe to future generations. And up till now, the way we've done it is we've treated the government decision as exactly the same as the individual's decision, that we just what we call discount the future by increasing amount as it goes on, and say it's not worth as much as the present.
And what sort of calculation do we use to discount the future? Is it a bit like an interest rate?
Yeah, it's like a compound interest rate. So, if you get, if you have a deposit, you get, let's say if you've got 5% interest, you're going to get, and if you reinvested that, you'd be up to $1.05 in a year's time, and then a little bit more than $1.10 in 2 years' time, because you'd be getting 5% on 5%. That's called exponential interest or compound interest. Well, we do the same with benefits, except we divide through by 1.05 in a year's time. We divide through by a bit more than 1.10 in 2 years' time, and a bit more than 1.15 in 3 years' time, etc. So we start really discounting the future in a heavy way if we have quite a large, the equivalent of an interest rate, which we call the discount rate.
So it's just occurred to me that if you have a high discount rate, let's say it's 10%, because compounding interest is the most powerful force in the universe, according to Einstein, if you have 10%, that means it doesn't take long before the benefits that I can see from this motorway or hospital or whatever it is in, let's say, 10, 11 years' time, actually almost worth nothing. And the costs, the big upfront costs I have to put into a project right now, they're really big in my calculation. So it seems like the higher the discount rate, the fewer projects, the less long-term investment we do.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And 20 so years ago, Treasury was using a discount rate of 10%, and this is real. This is after the effect of inflation. So let's say if inflation was 2%, it would be a 12% discount rate. But let's say we'll just deal in real rates. So they were using 10%. They reduced that to 8, then 6, then 5. And 5 is what they've been using up till the end of last year, when they've made some alterations, which we can talk about, and which I think are very sensible alterations. But when you've got a very high discount rate, it basically means we don't care about future generations, really, at least for some things, because we're discounting the benefits to the future generations.
So is that one of the reasons why, over the long run, governments of all different flavours have, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, invested relatively less in these long-term big projects than maybe, say, our predecessors from the 40s, 50s and 60s who were building dams and motorways and suburbs all over the place?
Yeah, actually, we haven't invested. Our rate of investment in infrastructure hasn't been that low, according to the Infrastructure Commission. It's been sort of around the OECD average. What it does do, though, is it favours projects that have short-term payoffs relative to projects that have long-term payoffs. So you'd be better off doing something that is going to benefit a local shopping centre for a couple of years or something like that, rather than a long-term payoff to future generations. So it's transferred the benefits to the current electorate, one might think, relative to future generations.
So how did we come up with that 10% number to start with? Because 10% on the face of it seems quite high. Maybe it didn't feel high in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but it seems quite high. Why did Treasury have such a high number, or it feels like a high number now?
Yeah, well, there's a real rationale for it in some circumstances. If you think, let's say the government borrowing cost was up around that rate, then the government's also going to have to service its debt, and that's going to be, so if we make a big investment now and we borrow to fund that debt is going to also go accrue to future generations. And so if we're paying high interest, then essentially what the idea was that the discount rate should be set in relation to both what the government was paying on its debt, and also actually what you could have used that money for if you'd, say, put it into an equity fund like the New Zealand Super Fund. And if the New Zealand Super Fund was earning that much money, then why shouldn't you expect the same sort of returns as in the New Zealand Super Fund, for instance? So that's one rationale. And it's the accepted rationale in the private sector, and makes sense in the private sector to do that. And it also makes sense to do that for market sort of investments in the government sector. If the government was deciding to start a new insurance company, for instance, that competed with the private sector, in broad terms, it should use a very similar discount rate for the same reasons the private sector does. Where it doesn't work so well is in what we call non-market investments, or investments that are designed to benefit future generations in areas that there's no market role. Let's say a clean river, or issues of climate change, etc., although that's complicated by the international factor. So let's think about a clean river. Then we've got an intergenerational issue as to how future generations might value a clean river, what benefits they might get from that. And if we just use a market discount rate for that, we might be really penalising future generations for those types of benefits that we might think they will value.
So Treasury has had a debate about this 10%, and it's been quite intense at times, because you're really talking about decisions about our intergenerational future and what we as a society value and how much we value it. For example, should we invest for our grandkids, our great-grandkids, or should we use the money now and have a party? So what has Treasury come up with after this debate?
Well, first of all, let's just make it clear that Treasury has over time reduced it from a 10% rate to an 8% to a 6% to a 5%. So where it was through to late last year was a 5% real discount rate, which as I said, for market projects certainly made sense. I didn't have any disagreement with that. However, we then thought about, and some of the advice I gave to Treasury, and Treasury considered other advice as well, as to whether we should differentiate between these sort of market-oriented projects and projects such as investing to maintain cleanliness of a river, or if you think about the social investment approach, whether we should invest to make sure that the welfare or well-being of the next generation or 2 generations or 3 generations' time is looked after. Should we invest, for instance, in tamariki who are currently disadvantaged, and if we discount their future benefits by a lot, then we actually wouldn't bother investing. So that just seemed to be completely counterintuitive. So where the advice I gave came up with, and hopefully it was part of the influence, was that there are certain elements like that where we actually value those benefits, whether it's benefits to tamariki 1, 2, 3, 4 generations time, or benefits to the environment, that we differentiate between those and typical sort of market consumption goods. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I might think that in a personal sense, I'm not too fussed about running down my assets and reducing perhaps my consumption in 20 years' time, if I'm still alive in 20 years' time. But I want the river next to me to be just as clean in 20 years' time as it is today. Why would I assume that I should discount those two benefits exactly the same way? I think they're entirely different things. They're not commensurate. So the idea here is that there are certain things that we should not value at the market rate, certain long-term benefits that we shouldn't value at the market rate, and we should have a much lower rate. And where Treasury's come to on that is that we should use a 2% discount rate for that. That's a little bit arbitrary, but it's in line with some other countries that have similar sorts of rates. Germany has a much lower rate. The UK has around 2%. Some other countries have much higher rates. So there's no international consensus. But it seemed like a broadly sensible change, given they were changing from doing everything at 5% to now saying, well, we're going to run a market rate for the market things and a 2% rate for these non-market ones.
Kia ora koutou, this is Toby Manhire, host of the spin-off politics podcast Gone by Lunchtime. Join me with Ben Thomas and Annabelle Lee Mather for a special live pod event April the 9th in Auckland at Q Theatre. We'll have bells and whistles and animals and children and special guests all gathered to discuss the state of the coalition government halfway through the term. That's April 9, Q Theatre. Tickets are available now from thespinoff.co.nz/events.
Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE SIPC.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you that Michelob Ultra is giving you the chance to win tickets to the NBA Finals. That's right, the 2025 NBA Finals. Just head to michelobultra.com/NBA Finals. Michelob Ultra courtside NBA Finals sweepstakes. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents, excluding Maryland residents. 21 up. Begins at 9 a.m. EST on February 16, 2025. Ends on May 5th, 2025. See official rules at michelobultra.com/rules for price and details. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
So 2% sounds like we're starting now to value the future benefits and the future costs, out a few decades with some value for our grandkids. What about those costs and those benefits, which are definitely there, but they're not really easy to measure? And you could argue they may be costs or benefits that affect other people, not necessarily me. Or other things like the air or the water or the land. How do you make sure that when you make a decision about, let's say we invest in a public transport network, trains and buses, electric, instead of just keeping driving cars, that's going to improve people's health. It might mean we produce lower emissions, and if we get really lucky and the rest of the world also reduces their emissions, we might not heat up the planet so badly we have these huge storms. But that's really hard to measure. So how do we make sure when you make these decisions about these social projects or rivers or hospitals or schools that we also look at these non-sort of material, what we call the externalities in the economics game?
Yeah, well, that's part of the trick in cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis, by the way, is just shorthand for what's called social cost-benefit analysis, which includes all of these aspects theoretically. So we should be including all these benefits, the types of things that you've talked about in our calculation of benefits. If that's very hard to do, then what we might do is just run scenarios and say, what if the benefit to that a future generation is going to value this clean river or this aspect of climate or whatever. What if it was $100 million? Then how would that change our calculations of whether this project is worthwhile? What if it was worth $500 million? How much would it change our calculations? And then see how robust our rationale for the project is based on very dispersed values there. We shouldn't ignore them. That's the most important thing. Just because they're hard to value, we don't ignore them. We put them in with a range of values that might be plausible and see whether we come up with consistent answers over time. Now, that's separate from the discount rate. That's saying if the future generation valued this benefit at, say, $100 million, I still then have to choose how much I discount that future generation by. So there's a different step. So there's two different things. So would the future generation value a clean river at $100 million or $500 million? And then whatever number we put in for that, how do we discount that back to compare it to today's costs and benefits? So the two different things.
Yeah, as I get a bit older, I'm 58 almost now. I'm starting to call myself a grand old man. I start to think differently about the future and about my grandkids yet to be born. I look hopefully at my daughters, and I begin to value what matters differently. There may have been a time when I really cared about, can I buy the car now? Can I go and have a party now? But I start to think differently about the future when I start thinking about my grandkids, my great-grandkids. And I wonder whether the discount rate way of measuring future benefits and costs actually take into account how people's views change over time. And let's say you have a dominant group in society who might be a certain age, and that's expressed in their political views, whether those changes are taken account of when we think about discount rates.
Well, yes, you're dealing with the problems of democracy there, which is outside of my pay grade, I'm afraid. But what I think what we need to do, and the area that I'm working on currently, is differentiating between the way an individual discounts their own situation between now and, say, 20 years' time, or however long they might have, and how they discount future generations' benefits. And I think there's a fundamental difference between those two for the reasons you've just talked about. I know that, in 50 years' time I won't be alive, but I value the benefits that accrue to my grandchildren in 50 years' time very strongly. So there's a very big difference, I think, between the way we discount our own personal outcomes in the future and the way we discount future generations in the future. And the problem up till now is that we haven't differentiated between those two things. We've basically treated them as if future generations are just parts of ourselves, and we're prepared to discount that away, which I think is fundamentally non-intuitive and incorrect, basically. So,
yeah, because in a way it speaks to our values as a society. If we're all about the individual and the now, we're going to have a high discount rate. And if we're all about the collective and multi-generational views on the world, we have a very low discount rate. How do we value cleaning up a river versus, how do we value building a shopping centre?
Yeah, so I've been advocating the adoption of different discount rates for different purposes. I'll give you a different example, and it's one when I look out of my office window, I see the beehive, and I think, okay, well, there's a couple of aspects here. There's a physical building, and there's what happens within it, which is, the actions of democracy. And if I had to apply a discount rate to the building, I'd be quite prepared to see that run down over time. It doesn't seem to me to be particularly important to keep those buildings intact in the way they are now. But I would apply a zero discount rate to democracy. Basically, I want in 50 years' time or 100 years' time, I want the state of democracy to be as good as it is now. Be even better if it was better, but I want it to be at least as good as it is now. So I'm applying effectively a 0% discount rate to the continuation of democracy, whereas I might be applying a 5% discount rate to the building itself. So that's where I think we need to get away from this idea that there's a single discount rate and think about, okay, which actions and which aspects do we think are really important to maintain, both for ourselves, for the future, and more importantly, for our grandchildren, great-grandchildren in the future.
And increasingly, we're talking about how the climate is changing. And, there's lots of scenarios about how hot we could get, how damaging that could be in terms of storms and sea level change. And there is this idea that the stakes get higher and higher, and the damage gets exponentially higher depending on the scenario, and that maybe we should use a discount rate that's negative in the same way that for a period, there were government bond yields that had a negative rate. What do you think about negative discount rates for those, long-tail, black swanny type events that are so far out in the future but so big you have to think about them?
Well, I think actually the proper way of doing that is to attribute a very high benefit to those rates and then apply a probability to how likely they are to happen, rather than changing the discount rate in particular for them. As we approach what we call tipping points in the environmental literature, the benefits to escaping those tipping points are very, very high. And that can also be in a river situation, a climate situation, etc. So I wouldn't play around with the discount rate for that, but I would attribute very high benefits if we were getting to disastrous sort of territory.
Arthur Grimes, a senior fellow at Motu and professor at the School of Government at Victoria University. Ngā mihi nui, thank you so much for being on When the Facts Change.
Thanks, Bernard.
When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with KiwiBank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how KiwiBank are making Kiwi better off.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.